Chokma, Hashlaka Chokma, Sahochufot, Shannon Speed, Chikasha Micha Chata Saya, UCLA American Indian Studies Center Director Saya, Gabrielino Tongva, Uglako Yagnimako, Api Sahanchi, Ikanatoka, Hachimanolili. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to today's special event. I'm Shannon Speed, and I'm Chickasaw and Choctaw by descent and a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation, and I'm the director of the UCLA American Indian Studies Center. In my Chickasaw greeting, I recognize the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional caretakers of Tovaangar, the unceded land that encompasses much of what is currently called Los Angeles, as well as the South Channel Islands, and upon which the American Indian Studies Center and UCLA reside. As a land-grant institution, we pay our respects to the Hunukritam ancestors, Ahihiram elders, and Eohinkem, our relatives, relations, past, present, and emerging. I also said Hashlukachukma, welcome to those in the audience. We're so glad that you've joined us today. And Ishlukachukma to our honored guest, Ellen Parker. We're so grateful that you could spend some time with us today. We're very happy to be partnering with the Native American Law Students Association on this event, and I'll turn it over to NALSA's co-chair, Ryann Garcia, in just a moment to introduce our guests. But first, I'll hand the baton to our AISC Programs Coordinator, Pamela Peters.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pamela J. Peters. I'm the Operations and Event Coordinator for the UCLA American Indian Studies Center. As a Dene woman living here on Tovaangar, I too would like to pay my respects to the Tongva ancestors, the elders, and all relatives, relations, past, present, and emerging. I feel it's important to acknowledge our tribal relatives' homeland, and I understand I'm a visitor here as my homeland is the Navajo Nation. Welcome to this afternoon's talk with Alan R. Parker, a 1972 UCLA Law alumnus. For the first portion of the afternoon, Mr. Parker will give a presentation. Thereafter, we will open up the discussion to the audience for questions. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat box, or if you like, either use the raise hand icon or contact me in the chat box, and I will unmute you so you can ask questions directly. And here is our co-presenter, Ryann Garcia from NALSA.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. Hi friends and relatives. My name is Ryann Garcia. I am currently one of the co-presidents of the Native American Law Students Association. We're really excited to be welcoming back one of our own alumnus today, Alan R. Parker, who's a citizen of the Chippewa Cree Tribal Nation on the Rocky Boys Indian Reservation of Montana. So Alan just has a very, very robust introduction here. So I just kind of want to go over some of the things that he has done during his career. So he currently serves as an adjunct faculty for the Maori Indigenous University. He was appointed in December of 2012 to supervise the work of tribal PhD students there. He retired in 2014 from the faculty at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington, where he taught advanced studies in tribal government within the Public Administration Master's Program. But before moving to Olympia in 1997, he served as staff director on the Committee on Indian Affairs of the United States Senate. He was appointed in 1987. So his duties there, which he goes over a lot of what kind of his experience was in the book, it included the development of a legislation program for the committee. Major legislative initiatives were enacted during this time, especially what we know as IGRA, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act of 1988, the National Museum of American Indian Act in 1989, the Indian Tribal Self-Governance Act of 1990, and one that the UC system knows very well, NAGPRA, the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act in 1991. So I'm really excited to hear about these things from Alan, but he also served as the Chief Counsel to the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Indian Affairs from 1977 to 81. Under his direction, the Select Committee enacted ICWA, which is the Indian Child Welfare Act in 1978, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which is also known as AIRFA, and Indian Land Claims and Water Rights Legislation Settlement Acts based on UN principles of free, prior, and informed consent. So also really excited to hear his thoughts on that, his thoughts on developing UNDRIP initiatives. But even before all this happened, Alan attended St. Thomas Seminary from 1960 through 1965, where he earned his bachelor's in classical philosophy. He then attended UCLA School of Law from September 1969 to 1972, where he received his JD. Before law school, he actually served in the Army from 1965 to 68, and he was awarded a Bronze Star Medal in 1968 for outstanding leadership services. After that, when he got into his writing career, he published the following major works, one of them which we'll be talking about today, which is Pathways to Indigenous Nation Sovereignty in the 21st Century. This was released in April 2018. It tells the stories of his legislative accomplishments during his time in the US Senate. But he also published The American Indian Identity, Citizenship, Membership, and Blood, which was released in 2016. And in 2012, he published Asserting Native Resilience, Pacific Rim Indigenous Nations Face the Climate Crisis. So a lot of works here, a lot of overview of the work that he has done in his lifetime so far, and we're just really pleased to have him today. So welcome, Alan.
On my screen, I'm just unmuted. All right, thank you. And yes, I really appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you this afternoon. And as you mentioned, I graduated from UCLA Law School back in 1972, which is a long time ago now. But it doesn't seem so long to me. And we also, when Shannon was doing her welcoming remarks in introduction, I've seen that you also have offices in Campbell Hall. Is that right, Shannon? Well,
Yeah, that's right.
That's right. Well, Campbell Hall was, in those days, back in the, end of the 1960s and into the 1970s, was, the home for all of our Native programs. And so I'm glad to see that it is still serving in such a role. But let me get into my talk this afternoon. And I'd like to start with explaining how it came to be that a independent Committee on Indian Affairs was created in the United States Senate. And we underline the word independent because prior to that time, the authority, the jurisdiction over all matters having to do with Indian affairs was a subcommittee of the Energy Committee. And if you know how Congress works, basically you understand that members of the Senate, asked to get themselves appointed to a committee based on what their primary interests were. And so the membership of the committee was dominated by senators from the Western states and from states who had a strong interest in fossil fuel development and things of that nature, the use of public lands for mining. And when we were completing our studies with the American Indian Policy Review Commission, which was a 2-year comprehensive study of Indian affairs conducted under authority of Congress, we as a group made recommendations to our chairman, who at that time was Senator Jim Aberesk from South Dakota. And we brought to his attention the fact that the Senate was reorganizing its committee system in the spring of 1977, and that this was an opportunity to create an independent committee to take the authority of Indian affairs out from under the Energy Committee. And Jim came back to those of us who were still working on that Policy Review Commission and reported that because Bob Byrd, who was chairman of the Senate Rules Committee, owed him a big favor, he was able to persuade him to take this action. And so it was initially called the Temporary Select Committee on Indian Affairs. And the term select really didn't affect or have an impact in terms of the authority of the committee. initially, the committee had 5 members at that time because the Democrats had the majority membership in the Senate. It was 3 Democratic senators and 2 Republican. But I think that that was created in 1977, and the term select was dropped from its name back in 1987 when Dan Inouye took on the role of chairman, and he had been looking for, well, who could he appoint to serve as the staff director to the committee. And my friends and colleagues who were on the staff of this select committee were recommended that he hire, me, asked me if I would be willing to come back, and serve in that role. And of course, when the senior senator from Hawaii, which Dan Inouye was, he was elected to the Senate in 1961. So that was quite a few years between then and when he was appointed to be chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Indian Affairs. And one of the first things he did was to have the name of the committee changed to delete the term select. Dan Inouye, I think, took this responsibility on because he felt like there should be an opportunity for him to be of help to his Native Hawaiian constituents. And at that time, he knew very little about the tribes across Indian country or up in Alaska, but he was very interested in learning. And so he charged us with educating him. And so we gladly took on the role as much as we could. So let me go back to the work of this temporary select committee, because it set the groundwork. It established the model for how an independent committee on Indian affairs would operate. And we took up several pieces of legislation that were high recommendations coming out of the Policy Review Committee. And number 1 on our list was to protect Native families from having their children stolen out from under them. And if you know anything about the history of that era, you would know that there was a practice among social workers, social service agencies across the West, where they, I think, operated on their own idea of what would be best for these Indian children if they were adopted out or placed in foster care, but taken out of those poverty-stricken conditions that existed on Indian reservations, as well as taken out of the authority of the tribe itself, because in their view, that would be for the best of the children. They were motivated by the principle of best interests. And but there were thousands of Native children who were involuntarily taken away from their families and placed in foster care, placed in adoptive parents' homes. And so that was the number 1 recommendation that those of us who were working on the Policy Review Commission had, to protect the rights of Indian families and to protect these Indian children. So that's why we took up this Indian Child Welfare Act and were able to get it passed in 1978. And the other priority that we took up was to protect the practice of traditional religions as exercised by the tribal people around the country. And we primarily were motivated by pleas that we had received from leaders of the Native American Church, who explained to us that they use the peyote medicine in their ceremonies. And if you place yourself in the context of the 1960s and 1970s, you know that peyote was just simply regarded as a hallucinogenic drug, and so they had been arrested simply for possessing, the cactus buttons called peyote. And so that was the primary motivation for us to draft a law, which we called the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, AIRFA. So that we were able to get that law all the way through the House and the Senate. But when it came time to put it on the floor of the Senate for a vote, I had phone calls coming to me from the staff to the Energy Committee and the public lands, who were saying that their senators were concerned that people would bring claims to protect what they regarded as sacred sites. And they made it clear to us that their senators had high seniority in the Senate and the numbers. There were a lot more of them than there would be in a handful of senators who were interested in protecting the rights of Indian tribes to protect what they regarded as sacred sites. So I remember a meeting which was held in over at the House Interior Committee, at that time chairman by Mo Udall. And so my boss at that time, Jim Averisk, and Mo Udall got together, and myself and my colleague in the House, and they talk very frankly among themselves that, look, we don't have the votes. These guys can simply kill this bill. If we were to bring it up, they would quickly outvote us, and the bill would be dead. So they turned to me and said, what do you think they really want out of this? And I said, I've been told by several of the staff that if we deleted the clause that protected the rights of the tribal people to protect their sacred sites and deleted that as a right, that would eliminate their ability to bring lawsuits in federal courts to protect their sacred sites. And so my chairman and the chairman of the House agreed among themselves that this was a battle that we could perhaps succeed in later years, but if we wanted to get this bill passed, we could accept an amendment to delete that right to sue clause from the Indian Religious Freedom Act, and that's how it was passed. Now, since then, there have been numerous examples of how, had we been able to preserve that right to sue clause, there could have been lawsuits filed in federal courts around the country. And so that was a big loss and continues to be a very urgent need, I think, depending on which part of Indian country you're focused on, where were we able to at least bring them to court so that something could be negotiated. But that's again a battle that I think should be waged, but for now, that's my story in terms of how we had to negotiate amendments to get the Indian Religious Freedom Act passed. And then I want to briefly mention that we also took up cases of land displacement to settle land claims. The dominant case in the country was the the tribes in Maine, the state of Maine, the Passamaquoddy and Penobscot. They had found attorneys who were willing to bring a claim that their ancestral lands had never been the subject of any sort of treaty agreement or any sort of ruling act of Congress. And as a result, there were 2/3 of the state of Maine that were, they felt like they could prove were their ancestral lands. And so we were able to file that bill and entered into negotiations with the congressional delegation from the state of Maine and the tribal representatives and their attorneys, and they basically agreed to amend their claim and to give up their claim for 2/3 of the state in exchange for rights as a federally recognized tribe whose lands were under the federal trust responsibility of Indians. So that was the trade-off that they engaged in. But the principle that we thought that was established was that this trade-off was based on the consent of the tribe, which later was embraced by the United Nations when they adopted the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People under the terminology free, prior, and informed consent. So those were basic principles that were enshrined in the Maine Indian Land Claim Settlement Act and the Auchin Pima Maricopa tribe and their claims to protect their interest in the waterways running through their lands. So that Water Rights Claim Settlement Act also was negotiated and adopted with the free, prior, and informed consent of the tribe. And so I felt like those are the primary things I wanted to point out when we were able to launch a independent committee on Indian affairs. Now, when the Senator Abras' term in office expired, and he was not interested in trying to get reelected because the politics of South Dakota had changed. Jim was a self-described liberal Democrat, and I think it's been many years. I guess probably George McGovern was the last liberal Democrat that has been elected from the state of South Dakota. But at any rate, Jim was retiring, and his successor, John Melcher from the state of Montana, was entirely different in terms of how he viewed his role as the chairman of the committee. So after a year of trying to make some progress under John Melcher's chairmanship, I retired from my work in the Senate and took up other work. But when the Democrats regained the majority in the elections of 1986, and Dan Inouye took on the role of the chairman in 1987. Again, he called me and asked me would I serve as the staff director. So I was, quite willing to step into that role. And the first thing that was put before us came from a coalition of tribes that were seeking an amendment to the Indian Self-Determination Act of 1975. And they came and explained to me that the way the Bureau had interpreted the right to contract to take over the administration of governmental services on the reservation that was authorized under the 1975 Indian Self-Determination Act, that the BIA had interpreted that act, right to contract, as a procurement contract right, as contrasted with a governmental services contract. So they had written very, intrusive rules for the tribes that they had to meet. And the tribes felt like now that the Senate was under the Democratic controlled leaders, and in particular my chairman, Dan Inouye, they would, plus the state, the ranking Republican at that time was Dan Evans, who was well known for his work with the tribes in Washington state. So those two senators got together and met with the coalition of tribes who were interested in changing the rules and instead rewriting that law so it authorized a governmental compact agreement instead of these procurement contracts that the BIA had come up with. And so that was first adopted as a temporary change in the rules because the senators wanted to see how this change would actually work out. So they put into law a demonstration, 2-year demonstration of the compact way of doing things. And then, that was in 1988. And in 1990, that demonstration project was turned into the Tribal Self-Governance Act, which then was adopted as permanent law in 1994. So that was how we addressed the issue that the tribes had brought to us in terms of the intrusive role of the Bureau of Indian Affairs in its interpretation of the contracting rules under the Self-Determination Act. But in 1987, shortly after I had gone to work up on the Hill, the Supreme Court settled the case called State of California versus Cabazon Band of Mission Indians. Now, those of you who work and have your work in the field of in Southern California would be aware of how where the Cabazon Band is and what was going on perhaps at that time. But when we studied the results of the Supreme Court case, again, this was a situation where I had phone calls coming from Senate offices across the Hill. I had 5 to 10 phone calls from Senate staff who were saying, my senator is very concerned that this case that came down from the Supreme Court would give the tribes in their state. So this was senators from Washington, from Montana, from South Dakota, North Dakota, Minnesota, and so on. And they were saying, we envisioned that the tribes would turn their rights to engage in organized gambling into a miniature Las Vegas environment. And so they said, well, my senator would simply like for your committee to pass a law which overruled the decision of the Supreme Court. And Senator Inoue asked me what my recommendation was. And I said, well, I can see why these senators have some concern, but at the same time, this was the right to engage in high stakes bingo games and other sorts of gambling as an enterprise really was an opportunity for many small poverty-stricken tribes who lived in an area of dense population. And that certainly fits the description of Riverside County in California, as well as other locations up and down the coast of California. And we adopted a compromise that we felt would satisfy the interests of those senators who said, we don't want the tribes to turn our state into a miniature of Las Vegas. So the compromise were what was written into the 1988 Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. And predominantly it called for tribes to negotiate a gaming compact agreement with the state government. Most of the states had some sort of regulatory body to regulate gambling activities within their state. And that was a compromise agreement that I think has largely succeeded because the tribes have been able to use that authority to create a very successful tribal gambling enterprise, tribal casinos. But we also wrote another compromise into the law. It was a restriction on ownership by outside interests. Senator Inoue, being from the state of Hawaii, explained to us that, they were approached by interest from the mafia, and to tourist businesses in Hawaii that wanted to have a right to gain controlling ownership interest in those enterprises. And he said, we quickly understood that, these guys are from organized crime. They're the mafia. So we have never let them in the door of Hawaii. So if we're going to authorize and agree with the Supreme Court in terms of the rights to engage in organized gambling, I think we have to restrict them from being able to negotiate a partnership agreement with organized crime by insisting that 100% of the ownership of the tribal casino had to remain with the tribe. So again, this was a protective device that I didn't think we didn't have any real trouble convincing the tribal representatives that this was a good measure to write into the law. And finally, we also addressed the question of, let's see now, I'm just gonna have to refresh my memory. Profit sharing rules. We wrote a provision in the IGRA law that basically said that the tribes had to, first of all, use the profits from their gambling enterprise to operate, to meet the needs to operate a successful tribal government. And after they had been able to fund that need, the expenses for tribal government need, they could then distribute those excess profits however they wished. Now, over time, if we look back, I think the tribes have been very successful. Those tribes who are located near what we would call a strong market for such gambling enterprises. And these restrictions that we wrote in terms of the limits on ownership, on the need to, first of all, dedicate their profits to operating a tribal government, have not been restrictive or in terms of their ability to make a success of their casino enterprises. So if you look at how that has worked out today, the last reports I've seen is that collectively, the tribes who operate tribal casinos have generated profits in the range of $30 billion a year. And that is revolutionary in terms of its economic impacts in Indian country. Now, of course, not all tribes are located where there is something you would call a strong market for casino gambling or for high stakes, bingo or what have you. But the tribes in Washington State, where I've been living since 1997, and they had told me when I moved out there, some of their elected leaders had approached me and said, we're familiar with your work, Alan, and we would like you to consider an appointment to the State Gambling Commission. And Governor Gary Locke was willing to appoint you to the commission if you're interested. It's a non-paid provision, et cetera. And I was glad to accept, that role. And so I served as one of 5 members of the State Gambling Commission for a number of years, I think up until 2007, actually. And the tribes there in their compact agreement with the state have wrote in 2 provisions that I think are very worth studying and looking at. Number one, they wrote in that 2% of their excess revenue would be set aside to assist the city and county surrounding them with meeting governmental needs that arise from a high stakes casino operation. because some of them, for example, the Puyallup tribe in Tacoma or the Tulalip tribe north of Seattle, they have Tulalip tribe, for example, the last time I spoke with some of their leaders, they generated profits in the area of $1 billion. So that's, they draw from a market which is from the city of Vancouver, Canada, as well as the population of Seattle. And so they agreed that they would set aside 2% of their revenues to assist local governments. And they also created a 1% charitable contributions fund. So they take 1% of their profits and create a fund, appoint a group of individuals to oversee that fund, and they make grants to the social service agencies in their area. So again, this to me is a good policies that they came up with on their own and wrote into their gambling compact agreements with the state. Now, I'm not sure that tribes who have successful casinos in other parts of Indian country, and particularly California, for example, have they adopted similar policies, wrote such agreements into their gambling compact with the state. But it would be interesting. I'd be interested to know if your law students at UCLA were able to to find examples of that. Excuse me, I have a phone behind me. So I think that's really the main thing I wanted to discuss with you in terms of what I wrote about in the Pathways to Indigenous Nation Sovereignty bill, because it's basically simply a book to tell the story of legislation that has stood the test of time and continued to be very helpful to the tribes and the tribal people across the country. I think there's, Ryann also raised a question about the NAGPRA law, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1991. And this was the last piece of legislation that I had a role in. I would just like to comment briefly that that law has proven to be an international model among indigenous nations across the world. And they have successfully used that model to approach their governments. And I'm familiar particularly with the Maori people in New Zealand. So I think it's worth mentioning that, the need to protect the traditional grave goods and to protect the rights of people to, the rights of the tribal people to, the indigenous people, to repatriate those goods back into their care and custody has been proven as a successful model. So let me bring that to a close, and I'll be glad to engage in discussion or questions with any of your students or any of you.
Thanks so much, Alan. I had a question about, we were talking about ICRA and the gaming compacts, especially here in Southern California. I grew up in San Bernardino, like right on the border of San Bernardino and Riverside. So very much saw how much the San Manuel tribe was able to really affect the city of San Bernardino as far as developments that took place, like a lot of donations, a lot of different things with education. But I've also been wondering, my mom is an employee of the casino, so I've been wondering how something like the compact with the state, which came about because of IGRA, you have things like pro rata payments with the state that are kind of pre-decided. And what does that look like now during COVID? Like, what is the standard for how things would change when there's casino shutdowns? What kind of say the state has? And I know there's been some negotiations between tribes and Governor Newsom, but I just wanted to know what your thoughts were on that, because it's kind of an unexpected, I think, part of the legislation that maybe wasn't foreseen.
Well, I haven't really tried to take a close look at that, but I do know that those tribes who have been successful and have leadership that recognizes that it's in their interest as well as in the interest of their neighbors. If they have profits that are excess to their real needs. Now is a time in particular, when we're all dealing with the threat of the virus, and local governments and the state government, in case of Washington, I know, and also governor in California, that have imposed protective measures to try to have the people protected from having the virus spread more widely, or to so the tribal casinos were impacted initially, going back to March of this year, in the same way as other, hospitality type of businesses were impacted, which is to say they basically were shut down. Now they have gradually reopened, but then we've had a resurgence of the virus, the pandemic conditions, and I haven't followed what's been happening, and I know Governor Inslee here in Washington State reinstituted, restrictions on the type of, gambling, or excuse me, gatherings that could take place, or having numbers of patrons in the restaurants or bars in the area. So I wish we all knew better, what to foresee, because the success of the big pharmaceutical companies coming up with a successful vaccine is a big unknown. We just, I don't think anybody really can predict, even though I think we will benefit from the change in leadership at the national level due to the last election. We're still going to be facing some difficult times, in terms of the economic impacts as well as the impacts on the health and welfare of the people. So I guess that's that's what I would try to respond. I wish I could, be more knowledgeable about it, but.
No, that's great. Thank you so much for that. Just as far as the enactment of IGRA in general, I think, myself as a law student who's younger and kind of grew up with the casinos already existing all around me, I didn't really see a before and after. So I wanted to get your perspective on how IGRA impacted tribes and tribal casinos before and after, and how did it kind of lend itself to tribes kind of becoming more economically self-sufficient, or whether or not it established tribal economies. Just kind of your perspective on someone who was involved with that legislation.
Okay, sure. I mean, I think generally speaking, because, during the years when I was working in Washington, DC with the Senate committee and then other work that I was doing there, Senator Inouye, for example, wanted us to arrange for him to visit different parts of the Indian country and to see for himself, because he hadn't visited, Indian lands, in his time, before that. So we took 50 trips in the first 2 years that he was chairman. Patricia Zell, who was the chief counsel to the committee, and myself were his primary, staff to go with him on these trips. So we, it seems like 2 or 3 times a month we would be traveling to here or there. But so what we saw was that the conditions at that time hadn't been impacted by the success of tribes with the bingo game enterprises. But now there's been just radical difference. The tribes I'm most familiar with in the immediate area, the Puyallup tribe and the Tulalip are prime examples. they have used their profits to create a healthy tribal economy. I mean, they have used those profits to invest in enterprises that serve the needs of the population coming to, enjoy the, the recreational gambling activities. And they also have invested in industry outside of their own reservation. Particularly, they have invested in protecting the local salmon population to the extent that they could. So they have used their excess profits to the best they could to create a viable local economy and to take care of the environment in their surrounding area. Now, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm a little familiar with San Manuel Band, which is where you grew up and your mother works, because my dear wife was working for a number of years with Claremont colleges, and so Claremont is not that far from where the San Manuel Band is, north of San Bernardino, and I know that before they were able to have a successful gambling enterprise, they didn't have any kind of local economy. I mean, the tribe was basically like many other small poverty-stricken communities up and down the length of California. But now they have a very successful enterprises, just like I was describing for how Tulalip and Puyallup have used their revenues to support the needs of their local community, their neighbors, as well as invest and take part in, I think, charitable activities. I don't know them personally. I'm just following the San Manuel Band because I know that they've also been active at the national and international level. So I think that it would be a topic that would be interesting and worthwhile for some of your students to engage in.
Definitely, thank you. It's interesting. I don't know if you have heard our news at all at UCLA Law, but we were just awarded a $15 million donation from the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria up north. So we had just gone and visited them last year, and they were kind of going over their, what they've done with their casino and kind of their economic self-sufficiency. And then so we actually were able to bear the fruits of that all the way down in Southern California, which we're really grateful for. But it just kind of reminds me of this conversation to see the developments that are happening directly from legislation that you worked on. So I thought that was really cool. But also, one of the things I was thinking about when I was looking at your book is just kind of political involvement and how certain tribes, like maybe in California, are able to engage in politics, interact with the governor, influence elections at all. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I've really been impressed with what they've been able to do on a number of referendum elections, that they financed. And the fact that they were able to work together as a group. Sequan bands, there's like, I think 6 or 8 different bands of the Sequan Indian Nation. I'm forgetting right now their self-description for who they are as a people, but Kumuye people. And they've set a good example, I think, that other groups of tribes up and down the state have spent some time learning how they were able to succeed in protecting their interest on local referendum and on local political matters. So, and this is, very different from the era of the 1970s and the 1980s, which preceded the widespread development of successful tribal casinos. The tribes in Washington state have also made political contributions to the campaigns of the statewide officers for the governor's election, the two U.S. senators from Washington State, as well as the local congressional races. So again, you know, they're like any other PAC, whether it's created by corporate interests or labor unions. You know, they support candidates who they feel are good public servants, good candidates worthy of support. And that sort of political support has done well in terms of how these political office holders have themselves been influenced to be more observant, more interested in meeting the interests of the tribe, to working together as in sort of a partnership arrangement. And so that's a phenomenon that's again new to Indian country from the days when I was, you know, going to school at UCLA or before or after that. So just being able to wisely use the money that their tribal casino enterprises have generated. And I know that the indigenous people in Maori, where I've done, you know, some work and have been visited, you know, 5 or 6 times now, they greatly admire the ability of the political leadership of the tribal nations in the United States to, you know, to succeed in what they have been doing. And they're also very interested in the potential for trade agreements. I mean, they, as an indigenous population in New Zealand, there's a range of agricultural products and other sorts of products that are unique, you know, to their country and to their people that they would envision would be very marketable goods were they offered by tribes in this country. And the casino enterprises often represent a way of selling such goods or making them available to that local market. But I haven't seen there has been much outreach on the part of the tribal representatives in this country to try to meet their interest or to see what their interest might be or in terms of reciprocal benefit from trade. Because of course, New Zealand, as an example, I mean, it's a small island nation as compared to this huge country of the United States. I think their population is about 4 million residents, of which 16% are Maori. So if you can envision, what if the tribal people in California represented 16% of the population? You know, that's a very different situation than what it exists now. So it's an interesting possibilities that I think are in the future for students and professional Native people in this country to explore. I know there's also interest up in Canada among the First Nation people, the indigenous people up in Scandinavia, you know, the Sami. Some also, I think anthropologists used to call them Laplanders or whatever, but their own name for themselves are the Sami people. And you know, through them, they have had some contact with some of their leadership, and they were saying, you know, look, we're right here with access to the European common market. You know, that's a very healthy marketplace for the kinds of things that you produce in this country. So they would be interested in trade with Maori, well, excuse me, with tribal nations here, American Indian people, and to producing goods and products that could be offered in the European common market.
Yeah, thank you for that, Alan. I just want to make sure that any participants now at this point who have questions, you can raise your hand in the participant, or you can put it in the chat. I do have one more question for you myself. As someone, you spoke a little bit about the international work and working in New Zealand. You and I had talked a little bit about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and this is kind of some newer legislation that came out in 2007. So the US, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia all abstained from signing on to UNDRIP until 2016. So in 2016, in the US, it was under Obama, but also New Zealand were finally able to sign on to UNDRIP. And so this is something also that you have seen kind of a before and after. I'm just interested as someone who worked on this, on a lot of legislation that the language is mirrored in UNDRIP, but which was US kind of domestic federal legislation. How do you see UNDRIP now kind of playing a part in either amplifying that legislation domestically or maybe leading to like new mechanisms in the US? Because it's definitely a different approach through a human rights framework, as opposed to a little bit more restrictive legislation that we've seen like NAGPRA and IRFRA. So just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Well, thank you for the question. And I wanted to mention one other aspect of the possibilities, and that's in the internationally, companies and artists have used the rights of intellectual property, copyright law and trademark law, to assert or to offer goods and products out in the international marketplace. And there have been across the indigenous people have felt like they have used these intellectual property laws to exploit them in ways that didn't exist before. And I think that the UN Declaration would be a tool that they could use to protect their cultural property rights from exploitation using these intellectual property laws. And so I don't know of how that if that has been done up until now, but it certainly has potential. Are there any other questions or comments? I mean, I know it's very hard to have a lot of exchange back and forth when we're dealing with using the Zoom technology. I have something that just popped up on my screen. I'm trying to see if I can't get rid of it.
Are you able to read the chat box?
Okay.
Okay, that might be it. Yeah, I mean, as far as kind of things that we've talked about, I've done some work and I'm really interested on your thoughts on UNDRIP being applied in an international realm where we have things like NAGPRA that were used as a model for international, for other countries, and what that might mean for like an international mechanism for repatriation, cultural property, and human remains kind of protection laws. That seems to be kind of a new emerging field. And so maybe that might be more specific for you to answer.
Well, I know, for example, even before the UN General Assembly adopted the declaration, there was a permanent forum on rights of indigenous people that exists within the UN organization. And the permanent forum became a more prominent organization after the declaration was adopted in 2007. And so there is, I think, a tool that could be useful to US indigenous people if they wanted to try to play more of a role in terms of the implementation of rights and protective provisions in the declaration. Are you familiar, are you knowledgeable about any tribal people from the United States who have served on the permanent forum?
I've worked with Professor Kristen Carpenter, who's worked on MRIP. So that's kind of the closest, the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples. So that's kind of gotten a little taste of it through that. But yeah, it seems like it's still developing work. But other than that, I just wanted to kind of wrap up the questions. I mean, I could pick your brain all day on this kind of stuff. It's really interesting to me, but I definitely want to give you some space to make some closing remarks. And then I want to hand it over to Dr. Speed to make some closing remarks on behalf of the center. So Alan, if you could just offer some of your closing remarks, that would be great.
Thank you, Ryann. And I've been very fortunate in life to be able to work with some of the leadership in the Congress, as well as the political leadership of tribal nations across the country, and able to achieve, some good things, make some progress on a range of different fronts. So that's why I particularly took up, this responsibility to try to share, those lessons through public, getting a book, put together and published. And and I think that I also wanted to mention something about, my own tribal home, the Rocky Boy Indian Reservation in Montana, and my tribal people, who are the Chippewa Cree. And the Chippewa Cree are examples of many other tribal people in the country, where back in the 19th century and in early part of the 20th century, we were involuntarily placed onto a relatively small, isolated reservation. And the Chippewa people were a band that had wandered across, going west, following sort of a northern trade route. And the two tribal groups were sort of unacquainted with each other historically, but quickly had to become acquainted after they were placed on the same, piece of ground. And I think one of the things that I was able to benefit from knowing the leadership back home with the Chippewa Cree tribe was to reacquaint myself with their cultural practices. So we are, the Cree people are sun dancers, similar to the Oglala Lakota people in the Southern Plains. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Sundance, religion and practice, but it's a strenuous exercise, 3 days and nights of dancing within the lodge, not partaking of any food or water during those 3 days, and offering prayers. So I did that for 5 years in a row, starting in '97, after I had moved back west to take my job out at Evergreen. And so I just felt like, it was so helpful and healthy to be re-engaged with our own tribal people. And I would, just kind of like to end my comments by urging people like yourselves who are students right now, finishing your work in academia, to also look to see how you might be able to make a contribution, particularly focused on the people back home. I mean, because I think that that's one of the common goals that we have, is to try to make use of whatever we learn and to share that with the people back home, and to try to make a contribution that they could gain some benefit from, and learn. We could learn together. So anyway, that would be my closing remarks. Again, appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you today, and perhaps in the future, if we have been lifted from the restrictions and the dangers of the virus, Yes, in the future, I'd love to make a trip down and see you in person.
That would be great. We would love that, Alan. Thank you so much again. And Dr. Speed, just want to turn it over to you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Alan. What a fascinating talk. What an amazing life you've led and contributions that you've made. I just want to say thank you. Thank you for being here, but more importantly, thank you for all the work you've done in your life up till now. And I come from a gaming tribe myself. I particularly thank you for that contribution because, to the point, to Ryan's point in one of her questions, I mean, I lived through the change in my tribe from pre-gaming to post-gaming. And I think my tribe has done a great job of what you were saying, building an effective governmental structure and being able to redistribute the wealth to our population and govern effectively. And it's just been, nothing short of revolutionary to watch and for all of our people. So we're very grateful to you for your work. It's just been fascinating. I haven't read the book yet, but I'm going to run out and read it right now. And we would love to have you down in person whenever that becomes a possibility. So thank you.
Okay, great. I want to thank you also, Alan Parker, for sharing your remarkable work that you have paved out for the American Indian people today. And thank you, Ryann Garcia, for moderating today. I greatly appreciate it. In closing, I do hope you enjoyed these cultural Zoom events offered by the UCLA American Indian Studies Center. If you wish to help us continue our work, please consider donating by visiting our webpage at aisc.ucla.edu and continue to follow us on social media at UCLA AISC on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And this concludes our Zoom event for today. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.